Diablo 4's open beta is almost upon us, so it's time we talk about all the 5 classes and which is the best one for you. They all offer unique playstyles, different strengths and weaknesses, which we're going to break down in this video, so let's dive right in. Let's get started with the Rogue, since this was the class I ended up enjoying the most in the previous betas. Now, the Rogue is a versatile and very mobile warrior who can specialize both in melee and ranged combat likewise. The class's best attribute consists in its weapon imbue mechanic, which lets it buff its attacks with shadow, poison or cold, combined with the powerful combo attacks that can augment its arsenal. Speaking of weapons, Rogue will have access to an extra 11 slot via the additional ranged weapon, which lets you equip both bows and crossbows. Bow or crossbow can be a solid option early on to avoid enemies reaching you, plus the synergy between Heartseeker and Barrage provide a great ranged AoE potential. Plus, you can couple this later on with the Shadow Imbue mechanic for extra damage and even more AoE. However, Flurry and Shadow Imbuement as a melee option also work very good. I tested this around level 25 and it might be even stronger once you reach higher levels. Just like all classes, the Rogue has access to talent specializations, which in this case includes access to combo points, inner sight, and preparation that you get via class-specific quests at level 7, 20, and 30 respectively. Going over a quick breakdown of each spec, combo points is the first specialization that you unlock, which makes all of your basic skills to now generate combo points. These can further be consumed by core skills for additional effects. For example, Flurry, one of my favorite melee attacks, gets a massive damage and attack speed buff for 4.5 seconds at 3 combo points, but pretty much all other core skills provide similar damage, buffs, and debuff mechanics the more combo points you generate. Now, in my previous class breakdowns, I also talked about the Inner Sight, the second specialization for the Rogue, which I found personally to be one of the strongest in the entire game at the time. Specifically because this places a mark on a random enemy, and attacking these marked enemies fills the Inner Sight gauge. Once the gauge is filled, you get 4 seconds of basically unlimited energy to spam your strongest attacks. And since most boss fights are a solo encounter, I noticed that they would constantly get marked, which led me fill the Inner Sight for an almost 100% infinite energy buff uptime, and this coupled with a shadow imbuement resulted in an extremely powerful synergy that melted literally everything at that beta stage. Meanwhile, we also have the main attributes, and rogues will want to focus on dexterity, which provides an increase in skill damage and chance to dodge, strength, which improves resource generation and armor, and finally intelligence for extra critical strike chance buff and buff to all resistances. Moving on to number 2, we have the Sorcerer, which was the second one that I maxed out in the demo, and this is described as a high-risk, high-reward class, even compared to the Rogue. Sorcerer draws its power from elemental magic, casting powerful fire, cold, and lightning spells at the cost of being more fragile. Luckily, spells like the fire and ice armor, deep freeze, and extensive access to crowd control mechanics later on eventually do make up for it. Being a caster type, Sorcerer has access to only 1 primary and 1 secondary weapon slot, which lets it equip daggers, wands, staves, or focuses. Blizzard also managed to make each elemental type feel distinctive enough and provide unique playstyles that you might want to test out. For example, fire spells are better at setting enemies on fire, providing a damage over time debuff, which you can later combine with conjuration spells or even the enchantment system to cause meteors, hydras, or other strong spells automatically summon on these burning enemies. Meanwhile, Frost has a more direct and higher initial damage, which also includes slowing enemies' movement and even providing deep freeze mechanics later down the skill tree. There's also Lightning, which excels at AoE, jumping from one enemy to another, especially via skills like the Chain Lightning in the core category that I found to be extremely strong option early on. Now, the Sorcerer's unique class mechanic is the enchantment system. This basically lets you sacrifice almost any active skill, place it inside a special enchant slot, which now prevents that from being casted actively, but instead gives you a passive secondary effect that can be very strong. For example, you can cast Blizzard manually if you want to, which is going to leave this AoE that deals quite nice damage, or just to place it in the enchantment slot instead, which will make it automatically trigger every 15 seconds or so and follow you for up to 4 seconds without having to do anything. Or Meteor, that you normally use to cast down a meteorite on enemies' heads, which in the enchantment slot instead automatically triggers periodically against enemies under the burning effect. but of course every single core skill and many more will have similar effects that you can check in the skill tree. As far as primary stats go, sorcerers will want to focus on intelligence first, which provides extra skill damage as well as buff to all resistances, willpower for increased mana generation, overpowered damage and healing, and finally some extra dexterity on top for the extra critical strike chance and chance to dodge incoming attacks. At number 3 we have the Barbarian, the third and final class available in the first beta weekend, and this has been described as a brutal and intimidating warrior with unparalleled strength who expertly wields an entire arsenal of weapons in combat. Now Barbarians have access to two types of general builds, either the Warlord, which focuses more on defenses, party-wide buffs, crowd control mechanics, and access to the bleed mechanic, or Berserker if you want to go for more immediate maximized damage, reckless offense, and access to self buffs. This class also has a decent early on AoE via core skills like Upheaval or Whirlwind, which will consume fury that you generate naturally in combat or via basic attacks, but you also have access to shouts that provide certain buffs, including generating a lot more fury. Now the Barbarian's unique class mechanic is its arsenal system and weapon expertise. This is the only class to have access to 4 weapon slots in total, which lets you use both two-handed weapons like maces or swords, as well as dual wielding. Luckily, you don't have to worry about switching between any of these, as your character auto-switches to the correct weapon when using certain skills that require them. Another thing to note is Barbarian also has access to expertise, which grants bonus effects based on how much you have leveled up each weapon type. So the more you play with these weapons, the more they level up, and eventually they will provide additional technique slots for extra effects and buffs. However, these technique slots are not available from my knowledge during these beta weekends due to the low level, so there's not much we know about them at this point. Finally, as a Barbarian, you will want to focus on the following attributes, starting with Strength, which provides skill damage and extra armor, Willpower for increased resource generation, overpowered damage, and healing received, but you can also add Dexterity if you want extra critical strike and chance to dodge incoming attacks. Now, once the open beta hits on the 24th this month, we'll get access to 2 more classes, the Necromancer and the Druid. Necromancer is the summoner class of Diablo 4, being able to conjure vengeful hordes of the undead, command them in battle via the power of essence, and sacrifice them when needed for powerful buffs. There are several types of spells Necromancer can focus on, including blood magic, which can provide healing and even immunity for a short duration, such as the one provided by Blood Mist ability for 3.5 seconds. Bone abilities, should you choose a more direct source of damage, this one favors critical strikes against enemies, as well as dividing the battlefield with skills such as Bone Prison to restrict them for a certain duration. And Shadow via spells like Decompose, Reap, Blight, or Sever, which can attack multiple times in a short duration, leave off damage pools behind, or buff your character defenses. Necromancer's class mechanic is the Book of the Dead, giving it access to 3 customizable summons. This includes Skeletal Warriors, Skeletal Mages, and finally the Golem. Each one of them comes up with up to 3 specializations and unique upgrades that let them fit different roles in combat. For example, Skeletal Warriors can be spec'd as Skirmishers, Standard Warriors that have increased damage but lower health, Defenders if you want more tanky-like companions, or Reapers, more aimed for AoE damage with long wind-up attacks that deal high amounts of damage. However, these units can also be sacrificed in exchange for personal buffs that increase your own powers. As far as weapons go, Necromancers get to access the Scythe, a unique weapon specific just to this class, but also to an assortment of swords, daggers, wands, focuses, or shields. And finally, the 5th class is the Druid, the shapeshifter of Diablo 4 that can transform at will between vicious forms such as bear or werewolf, command nature's wrath by unleashing the powers of earth, wind, or storm. Some of its basic attacks, like Claw or Maul, let you immediately shapeshift into a werewolf or werebear, respectively, providing additional single target damage or more AoE with the possibility of buffing up your own defenses. Druid is a very versatile class, however, so melee isn't the only option. You can of course also choose abilities similar to spells like the Wind Shear or Earth Spike from early on, or go with a hybrid between the two via Storm Strike, which is also a very strong early on option. The latter provides a buff to your weapon, which imbues it with electricity that can jump to nearby enemies and provide additional damage reduction to your own character. Now, the Druid specialization is called Spirit Animals, and this gives you a variety of boons depending on the spirit animal you have bonded with and unlocked. You aren't actually locked with any of them, of course, as you can swap freely between them at will. even get a second boon once you've unlocked all 4 spirit animals for a total of 5 buffs that you can have at the same time. However, unless something changes, it's highly unlikely that we'll get to unlock these in the beta since it's restricted to the starting zone and only level 25. In terms of equipment, the class has access to a main and an offhand slot which lets it equip one-handed, two-handed, as well as stave weapons. In terms of attributes, still not much is known, but being a rather versatile class, it will likely focus on strength, intelligence, and likely willpower, with maybe some dexterity left as well for that additional critical chance. And this is pretty much it with all the class breakdowns. Let me know down below which ones you're planning to play with first. Personally, I'm probably going to go with the Rogue as well, just because it seems very powerful, but Sorcerer is also very strong early on. The only question is, how will Druid and Necromancer fare, though from the looks of it, they seem to be pretty strong themselves too. This is it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.